The morning I left my house for the last time, the coffee maker was still running. I remember that detail more than anything else. The small red light blinking on the counter. The smell of dark roast drifting through the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had stood every morning for 31 years, making breakfast for a family that no longer thought I was worth keeping. My name is Margaret Ellen Hayward. I am 72 years old. And on a Tuesday morning in early March of 2025, my son loaded 2 suitcases into the back of his Chevy Silverado, told me to just trust him, and drove me 40 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio, to a place called Maplewood Senior Living. I did not argue. That is the part people never understand when I tell this story. They expect me to say I screamed or cried or begged. But I have never been that kind of woman. My mother raised me in a small house in Dayton with 4 siblings and not enough heat in the winter. And she taught me that dignity is the one thing no one can take from you unless you hand it over yourself. So I sat in the passenger seat of my son's truck with my hands folded in my lap, and I watched Columbus disappear in the side mirror. And I did not say a single word. His name is Daniel. Danny, I used to call him when he was small. He is 44 years old now. Broad-shouldered like his father was, with the same dark hair that started going gray at the temples in his late 30s. He kept both hands on the wheel the entire drive and talked about the facility like he was reading from a brochure. Private rooms, group activities, medical staff on site 24 hours. He said the word community 3 times. He never once said the word sorry. His wife, Renee, had not come. She said she had a conference call. I knew better. Renee had been the architect of this, though Daniel would never admit it. I had watched it happen slowly over the past 2 years. The way she tensed when I entered a room, the way she redirected conversations when I was mid-sentence, the way she began calling my presence in my own home an arrangement that was becoming complicated. My home. The house I had paid off in 2019. The house where Daniel had grown up, where I had nursed him through pneumonia at age 9 and driven him to baseball practice and stayed up past midnight helping him study for his LSATs. But I am getting ahead of myself. When we pulled into the parking lot of Maplewood, I noticed the flowers first. Someone had planted yellow daffodils along the front walkway, and for a moment, just a moment, they softened the blow of it all. The building itself was clean and beige. The kind of institutional neutral that tries very hard not to feel institutional. There was a fountain near the entrance that wasn't running yet, probably because it was still too cold for March. Daniel carried my bags inside. He spoke to the woman at the front desk with the confident ease of a man who had already made all the arrangements, signed all the papers, handled everything, without ever once asking me what I wanted. A young aide named Tracy showed us to my room. It was small, 1 window facing a parking lot. A bed with a green quilted cover. A television mounted too high on the wall. Daniel set my suitcases down and looked around the room with the expression of a man who had convinced himself he was doing the right thing. "It's nice, Mom," he said. "You're going to like it here." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had learned to walk holding my index finger. This man for whom I had given up a full-time teaching position to stay home during his difficult years. This man standing in a room he had chosen for me, in a building he had selected, at a distance from my home that felt precisely calculated. "All right, Danny," I said quietly. He hugged me once, stiff, brief, and then he left. I sat down on the edge of the bed and listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway. I did not cry. I looked at the window. Outside, a sparrow landed on the edge of a planter, looked around and flew away. The coffee maker back home was probably still running. The first night at Maplewood I did not sleep. Not because the bed was uncomfortable, though it was too firm, with a pillow that smelled faintly of someone else's fabric softener. And not because the hallway lights stayed on until 11, and the ventilation system hummed at a frequency that seemed designed specifically to prevent rest. I did not sleep because my mind kept returning to the same question, circling it the way your tongue circles a sore tooth. When exactly did I stop mattering? I tried to trace it back, to find the precise moment when I had shifted, in Daniel's eyes, from mother to burden. Was it after his father passed? Richard, my husband of 38 years, who died of a sudden cardiac event in November of 2022 and left behind a grief so large I sometimes felt it had its own physical weight, its own temperature? Was it after that, when the house became just me rattling around in 4 bedrooms, and Daniel and Renee began looking at the square footage the way people look at something they want? Or was it earlier than that? Was it the dinner in September of 2024 when Renee mentioned, very casually, over pot roast, that some of her colleagues had moved their parents into active senior communities, and found it to be genuinely transformative for everyone involved? I had smiled and passed the rolls and said nothing. But I had heard it. I always heard everything. That was something my family consistently underestimated about me. How much I absorbed in silence. I lay on my back in that narrow bed and stared at the ceiling of room 114 at Maplewood Senior Living, and I took quiet inventory of my situation. What I had with me, 2 suitcases. Clothes mostly. My reading glasses. A framed photograph of Richard and me at Rehoboth Beach in 2015. Him squinting into the sun, me laughing at something just off camera that I can no longer remember. My Bible. A small leather notebook I had kept for years. My phone. My reading copy of Middlemarch, which I had been meaning to finish for 8 months. What I had left behind, or rather what had been left behind on my behalf without my input. My home. My garden. The ceramic mixing bowls I had bought at a craft fair in Asheville in 2008 that I used every Thanksgiving. Richard's armchair. 31 years of a life assembled object by object, memory by memory. What I still had that no one could see, and therefore no one had thought to take. My clarity. My patience. And, as it would turn out, my name on several documents that Daniel had apparently forgotten about in his haste to simplify his life. But that would come later. In those first days at Maplewood, I simply watched and listened. That has always been my gift. Stillness. People speak freely around those they have decided are no longer significant, and I had apparently been moved into that category, which meant I was about to learn a great deal. My neighbors on the hall were a retired postal worker named Harold who shuffled past my door every morning at 6:15 with military precision, and a woman named Gloria from Cincinnati who had the brightest eyes I had seen in years and a laugh that seemed to embarrass her slightly, like a hiccup she couldn't control. Gloria had been at Maplewood for 14 months. She knew everything about everyone. On my 3rd morning there, she knocked on my door and handed me a cup of coffee she had made in the small common room down the hall. She sat in the chair by my window and studied me with the frank, unhurried attention of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Family?" she asked, nodding toward the photo of Richard. "Husband," I said. "He passed. Son or daughter bring you here?" "Son." She nodded slowly, the way you nod when something confirms what you already suspected. "Mine was a daughter," she said. "Lovely girl. Sends flowers on my birthday." A pause. "Never visits." We sat with that for a moment. "You're not going to fall apart, are you?" she said. It wasn't a question. I looked at her. "No," I said. "I'm not." She smiled then. Small, knowing, the smile of a woman who had done her own quiet surviving. "Good," she said. "The ones who fall apart stop paying attention. And attention," she tapped the side of her head lightly, "is the only currency that still spends at our age." I thought about that for a long time after she left. Outside my window, the parking lot was ordinary and gray. But somewhere in the middle distance, I could see the very top of a maple tree just beginning to show the first faint suggestion of green. It was early. The season was only just turning. So was something in me. By the 2nd week I had established a routine. Not because the staff required it, though they did gently encourage what they called structured engagement, a phrase that always made me think of a corporate memo. I created my own routine because routine is how I have always protected my interior life from exterior chaos. Richard used to say I could build a fortress out of a cup of tea and a well-timed silence. He meant it as a compliment. Took it as one. Every morning I woke at 5:30, before the hallway stirred. I made my bed with the precision my mother had insisted upon, corners tucked, pillow centered, because there is something quietly defiant about maintaining standards in a place that does not expect them of you. I read for an hour by the lamp near the window. Then I walked the interior corridor twice, 20 minutes total, nodding to Harold who was always already at it. His arms swinging with the purposeful rhythm of a man marching toward something only he could see. After breakfast, which was decent, I will give Maplewood that much, I sat in the small library off the main common room and I wrote in my leather notebook. I had been keeping that notebook for 11 years. It had started as a grief journal after my sister Carol passed from ovarian cancer in 2014, and over time it had become something harder to categorize. Part journal, part ledger, part record of a life. I wrote down things I noticed, things I remembered, figures, dates, conversations. Richard had always said I had the memory of a woman who had once been wronged and decided never to be caught off guard again. He also meant that as a compliment. In those early weeks at Maplewood, I began writing down everything. The date Daniel had last called, March 14th, the day he dropped me off. His tone, his exact words. The way he had said, "You're going to like it here," with the cadence of a man closing a chapter. I wrote down what Renee had said at that September dinner about senior communities. I wrote down the conversation from Christmas 2024 when Daniel had mentioned, very off-handedly, that the house might need to be reassessed for tax purposes. At the time I had filed it away without fully understanding why. Now, in the quiet of the Maplewood Library, I understood perfectly. The house, that was the center of it. I could feel it now with the cold certainty of someone who has finally stopped making excuses for people she loves. My house at 4417 Clearwater Drive in Columbus was paid off as I mentioned. It was also, according to the property assessment I had received last autumn, worth approximately $410,000. A modest colonial with a finished basement and a backyard garden I had cultivated for 2 decades. Richard and I had bought it in 1994 for $112,000 and had paid it off early because Richard was the kind of man who considered debt a personal insult. The deed to that house was in my name. Only my name. Richard had insisted on that when we refinanced in 2011, partly for estate planning purposes, partly because he trusted my judgment with permanence more than his own. "You're the one who stays," he had told me. "The house should know that." Daniel knew the house was mine. What Daniel may have been counting on, what I suspected Renee had quietly calculated, was that I was 72 years old, recently widowed, increasingly isolated, and now conveniently relocated to a facility 40 minutes away. And that I might, in my grief and my loneliness, be persuaded to sign things. There had already been one attempt. 3 days after dropping me off, Daniel had called. His first call, and after approximately 4 minutes of performed warmth, he had mentioned that he and Renee were keeping an eye on the house, and that his friend Gary, who was a real estate attorney, thought it might be worth exploring some options while the market was strong. He said he could bring some paperwork by whenever I was settled. I had said, "That's thoughtful, Danny. Let me think about it." I had no intention of thinking about it. I had every intention of making several phone calls of my own. The following Monday morning, I asked Tracy at the front desk if there was a private room where residents could make phone calls without interruption. She showed me to a small consultation room near the administrative offices, the kind of beige room with a round table that exists in every institution in America. I sat down, opened my notebook to a fresh page, and called my own attorney. His name is Walter Huang, and he has handled my personal legal matters since 2009. He is 61 years old, meticulous, and constitutionally incapable of softening bad news, which is exactly why I have always trusted him. He picked up on the second ring. "Margaret," he said, "I was wondering when you'd call. That stopped me for just a moment. You already knew. Yes. Daniel called my office 2 weeks ago, Walter said carefully. Asked some general questions. Didn't retain me. I couldn't call you attorney ethics. But I'm glad you called first. I looked at the blank page in my notebook. Picked up my pen. Walter, I said, I need you to help me make sure that what belongs to me stays mine. And then I need you to help me with something else. What's that? I need to make sure, I said quietly, that when the time comes, my son understands exactly what he chose. There was a brief pause on the line. All right, Margaret, Walter said. Let's get to work. Walter asked me to come to his office in person. I told him I was at Maplewood Senior Living in Westerville and that I did not have a car. There was a brief silence on his end, the kind that contains more than it expresses, and then he said he would come to me. He arrived that Thursday afternoon in a gray wool coat with his leather briefcase and the same reading glasses he had worn for the entire 11 years I had known him, slightly too large for his face and perpetually smudged. He shook my hand with both of his the way he always did, and we sat together in that small consultation room and talked for 2 hours. He confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Daniel had called Walter's office on March 12th, 2 days before he drove me to Maplewood, inquiring about the process of transferring property through a family trust. He had framed it as a hypothetical. He had used the words, estate simplification. Walter, who had been my attorney of record for over a decade, had answered in the most general terms possible and declined to go further without understanding whose interests he was being asked to serve. Daniel had not called back. He didn't know I was your attorney, Walter said, setting his notepad on the table. He was fishing. He's always been better at fishing than he realizes, I said. And worse at it than he thinks. Walter allowed himself a small smile at that. Then he grew serious again. We went through everything methodically. The deed to Clearwater Drive, still entirely in my name, untouched, as I had confirmed through the county auditor's website using the common room computer 2 days earlier. My investment accounts, opened jointly with Richard and transferred fully to me upon his death, now held at a Fidelity branch in Columbus. My life insurance beneficiary designations, which I had last updated in 2021. Richard's pension survivor benefits, which came to me monthly without interruption. A small savings account at Huntington Bank that Daniel had apparently forgotten existed entirely. I was not wealthy, but I was not helpless. And I was not, as someone had apparently assumed, confused. Walter drafted 3 things during that visit and finalized them within the week. First, I updated durable power of attorney designating my younger sister Patricia's daughter, my niece Claire, a no-nonsense woman of 48 who lived in Cincinnati and was an administrative director at a hospital, as my legal and financial agent in the event I became incapacitated. Daniel's name appeared nowhere in the document. Second, an updated will, significantly revised from the version Walter had on file, which was 8 years old and had been written in a different emotional era entirely. Third, a letter of instruction to be held in Walter's files, to be opened and acted upon at a time and under conditions that I specified. I will not detail the contents of the will here. Not yet. Some things unfold better in their own time. What I will say is that by the time Walter packed his briefcase and stood to leave that Thursday, something had shifted in the air of that small beige room. Not dramatically. There was no thunder, no orchestral swell. Just the quiet click of a briefcase latch and the particular stillness that follows when a decision has been made so completely that it no longer requires your emotional energy to maintain it. Margaret, Walter said at the door. I have to ask. Are you all right? Not legally. Personally. I considered the question with the respect it deserved. I'm in the process of being all right, I said. Which is different from not being all right. He nodded. Call me any time. After he left, I sat alone in the consultation room for a few minutes. Through the small window I could see the daffodils along the front walkway, slightly more open now than they had been 2 weeks ago. Yellow against the gray Ohio sky. I thought about Richard. About the way he used to say that the most dangerous person in any room was the quiet one who was also paying attention. He had said it admiringly. He had been saying it about me. I thought about Daniel as a boy, 7 years old, sitting at our kitchen table on Clearwater Drive, working through a math problem that had frustrated him to tears. I had sat beside him for an hour, not doing it for him, but staying present while he found his own way through. Afterward he had looked up at me with those dark eyes and said, "Mom, how come you never get frustrated?" And I had told him, "I do, Danny. I just decide what to do with it before I let it show." He had not retained that lesson. I had. That evening at dinner, Gloria slid her tray next to mine without asking and stole one of my dinner rolls with the shameless ease of a woman who has decided that small joys are non-negotiable. "You look different," she said, studying me. "Do I?" "Less like someone waiting for something bad to happen," she said. "More like someone who just remembered something important." I poured her coffee from the small carafe on the table. "Something like that," I said. She bit into the roll and looked out the window at the darkening parking lot, and we sat together in the comfortable silence of two women who understood, without needing to say it, that the world frequently mistakes stillness for weakness and almost always regrets it. April was coming. The maple tree beyond the parking lot was unmistakably green now, small and certain and reaching. I had not yet told Daniel about Walter's visit. I had not yet told him anything at all. He had called twice since dropping me off, brief, slightly guilty calls, the kind where the subtext is "please don't need anything from me right now." I had been warm and unremarkable on both calls. I had asked about the weather in Columbus. I had said I was adjusting well. I was adjusting, just not in the direction he imagined. April arrived in Ohio the way it always does, apologetically, with cold mornings that contradict the calendar and brief warm afternoons that make you believe, just barely, that the season means it this time. I had been at Maplewood for exactly 6 weeks when my granddaughter called. Her name is Lily. She is 19 years old, Daniel and Renee's youngest, and she is the one member of my immediate family who has always seen me as a person rather than a function. She called on a Wednesday evening from her dorm at Ohio State, and when her name appeared on my phone screen I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been clenched. "Grandma Maggie," she said. "She is the only person alive who still calls me that. Richard used to. How are you actually doing? And please don't say fine." I was sitting on the edge of my bed with the window cracked 2 inches, letting in the cool evening air, and I looked at the maple tree, which I had come to think of as mine in the small proprietary way you claim things that bring you comfort, and I told her the truth. Not all of it, but the honest shape of it. "I'm steadier than your father thinks I am," I said. "And I miss my house." There was a pause on her end. When she spoke again her voice had dropped, taken on the careful quality of someone navigating a room where they know the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. "Grandma," she said, "I need to tell you something. And I need you to not be upset with me for not telling you sooner, because I only just found out myself." I straightened slightly. "Go ahead, Lily." What she told me came out in fragments, the way difficult things do when the person speaking them is also processing them in real time. She had overheard a conversation, or rather, she had walked into a conversation that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. Her parents. Her mother's voice, fast and certain. The way Renee spoke when she had already decided something and was managing the logistics. Words Lily had caught before the silence fell. The property, the spring market, before she has a chance to, and then, the one that had sent Lily to her car and driven her back to Columbus to press her ear accidentally on purpose against the kitchen door 2 evenings later. "She won't fight it if we move quickly enough." I sat very still on the edge of my bed. The evening light through the cracked window was the particular gold of an Ohio April just before sunset, the kind of light that makes everything look briefly like a memory. "Lily," I said carefully, Did they say anything about paperwork? About anything they needed me to sign? Mom mentioned something about a family trust, she said. And about how it was ultimately in your best interest. She said it a lot. The way she says things when she's convinced herself. I knew exactly how Renee said things when she had convinced herself. I had been watching her do it for 18 years. Are you angry? Lily asked quietly. I thought about the question honestly. Anger is a thing I have always treated with caution, the way you treat a tool that is useful but damages you if you grip it too long. What I felt was not quite anger. It was something colder and more clarifying. It was the feeling of a fog lifting to reveal terrain you had half suspected was there all along. No, sweetheart, I said. I'm grateful. You did right by telling me. What are you going to do? Nothing dramatic, I said. Just what needs doing. After we hung up, I sat for a while without moving. Outside, the parking lot was emptying for the evening. Headlights sweeping briefly across my window as cars pulled out one by one. I thought about Renee. Not with hatred, because I have never been able to sustain hatred for long, it requires too much fuel, but with the particular sadness you feel for someone who has looked at a life built on love and seen only an asset to be liquidated. I thought about my garden on Clearwater Drive. The raised beds Richard had built for me in 2016, cutting and staining the cedar planks himself on a July weekend, complaining cheerfully the entire time about the heat. The rose bushes along the back fence that I had planted the spring after Carol died, because I needed something living to tend. The kitchen window above the sink, the one I had stood at 10,000 times watching seasons change in the backyard while the coffee brewed. The house was not just property. It was the physical record of a life. And someone had decided, in their clean and efficient way, that the record was inconvenient. The next morning I called Claire. My niece answered on the first ring, which told me she had been expecting me to call eventually. Claire is not a warm woman in the conventional sense. She does not offer comfort the way some people do, reflexively, like handing someone a tissue. What she offers instead is complete and focused attention, which in my experience is rarer and more valuable. I told her everything. The full picture, beginning to end, including what Lily had told me. She listened without interrupting, which is also rare. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Margaret, she said, I'm going to come to Columbus next weekend. And I'm going to bring my laptop because there are some things I want to look at with you. Property records. Account structures. A few other things. Also, I'm bringing you a proper coffee maker because the 1-cup pod thing you described sounds like a crime. Despite everything, I laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. I'll clear my schedule, I said. You're in a senior facility. Your schedule is clear. Claire. I'm joking. Love you. I'll be there Saturday. After I hung up, I opened my leather notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Below it I wrote 2 words and underlined them twice. Take stock. I had spent 6 weeks absorbing, feeling the shape of what had been done to me, letting it settle into something I could see clearly rather than react to blindly. I had made my legal arrangements. I had secured my documents. I had listened and watched and written things down with the patience of a woman who understood that the most powerful moves are rarely the fastest ones. Now it was time to understand completely and precisely what I was working with, and what, when the moment came, I intended to do with it. Claire arrived on Saturday morning with a large bag from Starbucks, her laptop under her arm, and the particular energy of a woman who has already thought 3 steps ahead before she walks through the door. She hugged me, firmly, briefly, the way she does everything, and then held me at arm's length and looked at me with those sharp hazel eyes that have always reminded me of her mother, my sister Patricia, who had the same quality of seeing past whatever surface you were presenting. You look better than I expected, she said. What did you expect? Honestly. Someone smaller. She handed me a coffee. You're not smaller. We set up at the small table in my room, Claire's laptop open between us, my notebook beside it, the morning light coming through the window at the angle that turned everything in the room a quiet gold. For the next 3 hours we went through everything methodically, the way you go through a house after a storm, room by room, checking what held and what didn't. The house on Clearwater Drive was secure. Walter had already confirmed that no transfer, lien, or trust document had been filed against the property. I was the sole owner of record, and nothing had been touched. But Claire found something that Walter hadn't specifically flagged, not because he had missed it, but because it was peripheral to the legal matters we had discussed. It was a detail that, once I saw it, rearranged several things in my understanding. Daniel's name was listed as an emergency contact and informal representative on my Maplewood intake paperwork. Standard procedure, the facility's admissions coordinator had explained when I arrived. Family member information for care coordination. Routine. But attached to that intake form, tucked into the packet I had signed on my first bewildering afternoon at Maplewood, was a 1-page document I had not read carefully enough in the fog of that day. It was a general communication authorization. It permitted listed family contacts to receive information about my residency status, billing arrangements, and, in a clause written in the particular small print that exists specifically to be overlooked, to act on behalf of the resident in administrative matters related to the facility. It was not a power of attorney. It was not legally binding in the way a POA would be. But it was enough of a foothold that someone persistent and confident, someone like Renee, who worked in pharmaceutical sales and understood the architecture of persuasion, could use it to begin having conversations. With the facility. With financial institutions that might call Maplewood to verify my residency status. With anyone who might need assurance that Margaret Hayward's affairs were being properly managed by her family. Claire read the clause twice. Then she looked up at me. Has anyone from the facility approached you about any financial matters? Anyone asked you to update billing information, change account details, anything like that? Thought carefully. The billing coordinator came by in my 3rd week. Said they were updating direct payment records. Asked if I wanted to add a secondary payment source. Did you? No. I told her my arrangements were handled and I'd speak with their billing department directly if anything needed updating. Claire nodded slowly. Good instinct. It wasn't instinct, I said. It was suspicion. She almost smiled. Same thing at our age. We drafted a formal written request that morning, which Claire typed and printed at the facility's front desk, retracting the communication authorization entirely and replacing it with a limited contact permission. Daniel could be notified in a genuine medical emergency and nothing more. The new document named Claire as my designated representative for all administrative and financial matters related to my residency. I signed it, Claire witnessed it, and we handed it to the facility administrator, a sensible woman named Mrs. Okafor, who processed it without drama and made a note in my file. That afternoon, while Claire stayed and we ate lunch together in the common room, Gloria stealing a look at Claire with undisguised approval, I told Claire about the will. Not the details. Just that it had been updated, that Walter held it, and that Daniel would not find its contents to be what he anticipated. Claire was quiet for a moment. Are you doing this out of anger, Margaret? She used my full name when she was being serious with me. Because anger makes bad architecture. It was such a precise thing to say that I had to sit with it before answering. No, I said finally. I'm doing it because what belongs to a life should reflect how that life was actually lived. Richard and I built what we built together. It should go where it was genuinely valued. Pause. And because consequences, when they're honest, aren't cruelty. They're just truth arriving on its own schedule. Claire looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, with the decisive finality she gives to things she has decided to fully support. After she left that evening, I sat in the common room with Gloria, who had been visibly waiting for a full report with the barely contained patience of a woman for whom other people's quiet dramas are a primary source of intellectual nourishment. Well, she said. Well, I said, I've spent 6 weeks understanding the problem. I think I understand it now. And now I'm going to be very, very patient. Picked up my book, which is the only thing that has ever actually frightened people who thought they had the upper hand. Gloria looked at me with those bright eyes for a moment. Then she reached over and patted my hand once, a small, certain gesture, and picked up her own book without another word. Outside, the evening was soft and darkening, the maple tree holding its new leaves against the dimming sky with the quiet confidence of something that had survived winter and was no longer worried about the cold. Neither was I. May came in warm and unhurried, the kind of May that makes Ohio forgive itself for February. Daniel called on a Thursday evening, the first week of the month. It had been 11 days since his last call, which had been 4 minutes long and had included the phrase, "We should really sit down soon," delivered in the tone of someone who means the opposite. This call was different. I could hear it in the first syllable, a careful brightness, the vocal equivalent of a pressed shirt. "Mom, hey. You sound good." "I feel good, Danny," I said. I was sitting in the small courtyard behind the facility, which the staff had opened for the season. There were potted geraniums along the low wall, red and pink, and the evening air smelled like cut grass from somewhere nearby. I had my notebook on my knee, though I wasn't writing. "Listen, I was thinking maybe I'd come by this weekend. Bring Renee. We could take you to lunch somewhere nice, catch up properly." I noticed the sequencing. Bring Renee. Not, come see you, just the two of us. Not, I've been thinking about you. Bring Renee, which meant this visit had a purpose that required a witness or a co-architect, and the lunch was the softening agent. "That would be lovely," I said. "Sunday works well for me." "Great. Great, Mom." A pause. The brief pause of a man regrouping slightly faster than he expected to need to. "I also wanted to mention, Gary, you remember my friend Gary Tolliver, real estate. He's put together some information about the current market. Columbus is really moving right now. Properties like yours, the neighborhood, the square footage. He thinks we could be looking at 430, maybe 450 if we time it right." There it was. 11 days of silence, and then Gary Tolliver and $450,000. All in the same phone call as the lunch invitation. "How thoughtful of Gary," I said pleasantly. "I just think it's worth looking at the numbers, Mom. The house is sitting empty, it's a lot to maintain, and if we could get you set up financially in a way that—" "Danny," I said gently, "let's talk about it Sunday. I'd love to see your face when we have this conversation." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Sunday." After we hung up, I sat in the courtyard for a while longer, watching a robin work a patch of dirt near the geraniums with focused, efficient determination. The evening was still warm. Somewhere beyond the facility wall, a neighbor was grilling, and the smell drifted over. Charcoal and something herbed, the smell of an ordinary American Saturday arriving a day early. I thought about what I wanted Sunday to look like. Not in terms of confrontation. I have never been interested in confrontation for its own sake. That particular theater of raised voices and slammed doors that accomplishes nothing except to make everyone feel briefly powerful and lastingly worse. I thought about it in terms of information. What I wanted Daniel to understand. What I wanted him to understand in a way that could not be argued with, interrupted, or reframed. The truth, delivered quietly, lands harder than anything shouted. I called Walter that evening and told him about the Sunday visit. He confirmed that everything on his end was in order. I called Claire and told her the same. She said she could be available by phone if I needed her. I told her I didn't think I would, but that I appreciated it. Then I called Lily. She answered on the second ring, slightly breathless, clearly between things in the way 19-year-olds always seem to be. Permanently in transit between one version of themselves and the next. "Grandma Maggie. What's up?" "Your father is coming Sunday," I said. "I wanted you to know." Beep. "Are you okay?" "More than okay." Pause. "Lily, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly without worrying about how it sounds." "Okay. Do you want to be there?" You don't have to be. This isn't something I'm asking you to manage or navigate for me. But if you wanted to come, if you felt that being present was important to you, I would not send you away. The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone deciding something real. I'll be there, she said quietly. All right. Come at noon. Your parents are coming at 1. Sunday arrived bright and almost summery. The sky over Westerville a clean and uncomplicated blue. Lily came at noon as promised, carrying a small bunch of grocery store tulips. Yellow, slightly overeager, wholly perfect, which she put in a plastic cup of water on my windowsill because neither of us had a vase. She sat in the chair by the window and we talked for an hour about her coursework, about a professor she admired, about a road trip she was planning for the summer with 2 friends. Normal, lovely, ordinary things. I wanted that hour. I wanted to remember what the air in a room felt like before it changed. Daniel and Renee arrived at 1:15. I met them in the small visitors' lounge near the front entrance, a room with upholstered chairs and a low table and a window looking out onto the daffodil walkway, which was still blooming, stubborn and yellow, and entirely indifferent to whatever humans were doing in its vicinity. Renee looked around the room with the quick, assessing glance she gives to every space she enters. Daniel looked at me with something that was trying to be warmth and was landing slightly short. He noticed Lily. Something moved across his face. Surprise, and beneath it, a more complicated thing. A recalibration. Lil, I didn't know you were coming. Grandma invited me, Lily said. Simply. Without apology. I let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. Then I gestured to the chairs and said, in the calm and level voice I had been saving for precisely this moment, "Sit down, Danny. There are some things I'd like to talk about, and I think it's better if we're all comfortable." Renee's smile remained in place, but her eyes shifted, just slightly, with the minute adjustment of someone who has just realized the room is arranged differently than they expected. Daniel sat. Renee sat. I folded my hands in my lap, the way I had sat in the passenger seat of his truck 11 weeks ago while Columbus disappeared in the mirror, and I looked at my son across the low table with the full, clear, unhurried attention of a woman who had spent those 11 weeks doing nothing but preparing for this exact moment. "I love you, Danny," I said. "I want to start there. Because everything else I'm going to say comes from that, even when it doesn't feel like it." The room was very quiet. Outside, the daffodils held their color against the blue May sky. I did not raise my voice once. That is the thing I want to be clear about because it matters to the shape of what happened in that room. There was no moment where I leaned forward with accusation. No moment where years of compressed feeling came pouring out in a way that could be managed or deflected or later described as emotional. I've seen what that looks like. I have seen how quickly a person's legitimate pain can be reframed as instability when it arrives too loudly. I had no intention of giving anyone in that room that particular gift. I spoke the way I have always spoken when the matter is serious. Quietly. Completely. With the patience of someone who has already decided that the truth does not need her help to be true. It only needs to be said clearly enough that no one can later claim they misunderstood. I told Daniel what I knew. I started at the beginning. The September dinner in 2024, Renee's casual mention of senior communities. I moved through the timeline with the precision of someone who has been writing things down for 11 weeks. The Christmas conversation about tax reassessment. Daniel's call to Walter's office on March 12th, 2 days before he brought me here. The intake paperwork and the communication authorization clause. Gary Tolliver and the Columbus Spring Market and $450,000 mentioned in the same breath as a lunch invitation. I did not editorialize. I did not say you betrayed me or you chose her over me or any of the other true things that would have given him something emotional to push against. I simply laid the sequence out, fact by fact, the way you lay cards on a table. Not dramatically, just face up where everyone can see them. Daniel's face moved through several things during this. Surprise first. Genuine, which told me he had not expected me to know as much as I did. Then something that looked like it was trying to become indignation. The reflex of a man who has been caught doing something he had half convinced himself was acceptable. Then, underneath that, something younger and less defended. Something that looked, briefly, like the face of a boy sitting at a kitchen table with a math problem he had gotten badly wrong. Renee was very still throughout. She had the practiced composure of someone who negotiates for a living, and she deployed it now. Hands folded, expression neutral, waiting to see where the ground settled before deciding how to stand on it. But I noticed her left thumb moving against the back of her right hand in a small, repetitive motion. She did not know she was doing it. I had been watching people's hands my entire life. When I finished, the room held its silence for a moment. Daniel exhaled. "Mom." His voice had lost the careful brightness of the phone call. We weren't trying to take anything from you. The house is sitting empty and we were worried about. Danny, I said gently. I know how this felt from the inside. I know you found a way to make it feel like care. People are very good at that. Pause. But I need you to hear what it looked like from where I was sitting. He was quiet. It looked like this, I said. Your father spent 38 years building a life with me. We bought that house with money we earned together, maintained it together, filled it with everything that made us a family. When he died, that house became the last physical place where all of that still existed. And within 2 years of his passing, while I was still carrying that grief, a plan was put into motion, carefully, gradually, to remove me from that house and position me somewhere I could be gently managed while decisions were made. I kept my voice even. That is what it looked like, Danny. I need you to sit with that. He did not speak immediately. That was the right response. I would have been more troubled by an immediate defense. Lily had not moved from her chair near the window. She was watching her father with an expression I recognized. Not accusation, but a kind of sorrowful attention, the look of someone updating a long-held understanding of a person they love. Renee spoke then. Carefully. Margaret, I understand how this might have appeared. But Daniel and I have been genuinely worried about you living alone. An empty house, the upkeep, the isolation. We felt that a community environment would genuinely. Renee, I said, and something in my tone, not unkind but absolute, stopped her mid-sentence. I've thought about what to say to you for several weeks. And what I've decided is this. I don't need you to explain your intentions to me. I need you to understand that intentions don't change outcomes. The outcome was that I sat in the passenger seat of your husband's truck while my home disappeared behind me, and no one asked me what I wanted. I looked at her steadily. That is simply what happened. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands. I reached into the small bag I had brought with me and placed 3 documents on the low table between us. The first was a copy of the updated durable power of attorney naming Claire as my designated agent. The second was a letter from Walter's office on his firm's letterhead, confirming that the deed to 4417, Clearwater Drive remained solely in my name, and that no transfer or encumbrance had been filed or would be entertained without my written and witnessed consent. The third was a simple single-page letter I had written myself. Not a legal document, not a formal instrument of any kind. Just a letter. You don't need to read that last one now, I said. It's for you to take home. Daniel looked at the documents on the table. He did not pick them up immediately. He looked at them the way you look at something that has confirmed a thing you were hoping wasn't confirmed. Mom, he said finally, and his voice had changed entirely now. Stripped of the brightness, stripped of the strategy, down to something rawer and less prepared. I'm sorry. 2 words. Small, late, and real. I looked at my son. This man I had loved before he had a name, before he had a face, before he existed as anything other than the most extraordinary fact of my life. And I felt the full, complicated weight of what it is to love someone who has disappointed you at the level of the bones. I know you are, I said quietly. I believe that. I did not say it was all right. Because it was not all right, and one of the few gifts I can still give him is my honesty. What I said next, I said looking directly at him without blinking. I'm going home, Danny. Back to Clearwater Drive. I've already spoken with Maplewood about my departure, and Claire is helping me arrange the transition. Pause. I want you to know that this decision has nothing to do with this facility, which has been perfectly adequate. It has to do with the fact that the house is mine, and my life is mine, and I am not done living it on my own terms. Renee looked up. Daniel's jaw tightened once, briefly, and then released, the physical gesture of a man standing down. Okay, he said. Just that. Bae. Outside the window, the daffodils were very bright in the afternoon sun. Lily, from her chair near the window, reached over and took my hand quietly, without drawing attention to it. I held her hand and thought about the maple tree in the parking lot and how it had looked that first cold March morning, bare and gray and waiting, and how it looked now. I left Maplewood on a Friday morning in the third week of May. Claire drove up from Cincinnati the night before and stayed in a nearby hotel, arriving at my door at 8:30 with 2 proper coffees and the calm, organized efficiency of a woman who has managed hospital logistics for 20 years and finds moving one elderly aunt's belongings from a single room to be, relatively speaking, a light morning. I had already packed. It had taken me less time than I expected, which said something about how little I had truly settled here. Not because Maplewood had been unkind, but because some part of me had always held myself in the careful, temporary posture of someone who knew she wasn't staying. My 2 suitcases, my books, my notebook, Richard's photograph from Rehoboth Beach, the plastic cup that had held Lily's yellow tulips, which were long gone but which I kept because it had held them. Gloria was in the hallway when I brought out my first bag. She was standing by the window at the end of the corridor with her morning coffee, ostensibly looking at the parking lot, which we both knew she was not actually looking at. When she heard my door, she turned and regarded the suitcase with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: approval, affection, and a particular quality of wistfulness she would never have named out loud. "Clearwater Drive," she said. "Clearwater Drive," I confirmed. She nodded slowly. She looked at me for a moment with those bright, frank eyes. Then she said, "Don't forget to actually plant something this year. Not just tend what's already there. Plant something new." It was such a specific and knowing thing to say that it stopped me for a moment in the middle of the hallway with my suitcase handle in my hand. "I will," I said. She turned back to the window. "Good. Now go before I say something embarrassing." I touched her arm once as I passed. She did not turn around, but I felt her lean into it slightly, the way people do when they're accepting comfort they've decided not to formally acknowledge. Harold was at the end of the hall, already mid-March. He gave me a crisp, serious nod as I passed, the nod of a man who considers such partings to require dignity rather than sentiment, and I nodded back with equal gravity, and that was exactly the right goodbye for Harold. Mrs. Okafor, the facility administrator, shook my hand at the front desk with genuine warmth and said she hoped I'd visit sometime, which was a kind and probably sincere thing to say. Tracy, the young aide who had shown me to my room on that first bewildering afternoon, hugged me impulsively and then looked slightly embarrassed about it, and I told her she was very good at her job, which was true and which I could see mattered to her. Then Claire and I loaded the car and drove away. I did not look back at the building. Not out of bitterness. I had made my peace with what those 11 weeks had been, what they had given me in terms of clarity and stillness and the unexpected gift of Gloria's company. I didn't look back simply because I was looking forward. The road ahead was ordinary and familiar, the Columbus skyline visible in the middle distance, the late May morning opening around us like something long folded being finally smoothed flat. We turned onto Clearwater Drive at 10:15. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way houses always do when you've been away, as though they've pulled themselves in slightly against your absence. The lawn had been mowed recently, which surprised me until I remembered that Daniel paid a service through the winter. The roses along the back fence, I could see their tops above the roofline from the driveway, were leafed out fully, heavy with the green that comes just before the first bloom. Claire unlocked the front door with the spare key I had given her and pushed it open and stood aside. I walked in. The house smelled the way houses smell after a long closure. Still slightly cool, with a particular quality of air that has been holding itself in waiting. The furniture was exactly where I had left it. Richard's armchair in the corner of the living room. The fabric worn smooth on the right armrest where his elbow had rested through 30 years of evenings. The ceramic mixing bowls on the kitchen shelf, earthy red and green and cream, exactly where I had left them in their stack. The kitchen window above the sink, the backyard visible through it, the cedar raised beds Richard had built standing in the morning light exactly as he had left them. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Claire put the kettle on and did not say anything, which was the right thing to do. I set my hand flat on the kitchen counter. The cool laminate I had stood at 10,000 times, and I breathed in the specific, irreplaceable smell of my own home. And something that had been held together very carefully inside me for 11 weeks, held together with intention and patience and the deliberate decision not to break, allowed itself, quietly and without drama, to release. I did not sob. I want to be clear about that. What happened was quieter than that. A long, slow exhale that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs, the way a house settles after a long day, timbers easing into themselves. Richard, I thought. I'm home. Claire put a cup of tea on the counter beside my hand without comment and moved tactfully into the living room to give me the moment. I stood at my kitchen window and looked at the backyard. The raised beds were bare but not neglected, the soil dark and ready, holding its potential with the patience of things that understand seasons. The rose bushes were dense with leaf, one or two early buds already showing the first faint blush of color at their tips. I thought about what Gloria had said. Plant something new. I thought about the maple tree in the Maplewood parking lot, how I had watched it move from bare gray branches through the first tentative green of early spring to the full, certain canopy it wore by May. I had watched an entire season turn from that window. Something had turned in me along with it. The tea was Earl Grey, which Claire knows is what I drink in the mornings. She had brought a box from home, which meant she had thought about this moment before she arrived, which meant she had understood it in the way that people who love you quietly always understand the things you haven't said. I picked up the cup with both hands and held its warmth for a moment. Then I opened the kitchen window, the one above the sink, the one I had stood at 10,000 times, and let the late May air come in. It smelled of cut grass and warming earth and the faint sweetness of whatever was blooming in the neighbor's yard 2 houses down. The white flowering tree whose name I had never learned but whose fragrance I had marked every May for 30 years. Everything was exactly as it had been. And I was not exactly as I had been. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I held them both without needing to resolve the tension between them, the way you hold 2 notes of a chord and let them simply be what they are together. In the living room, Claire was making small efficient sounds, opening windows, checking the thermostat, doing the practical things that needed doing. She would stay through the weekend. Lily was coming Saturday. The house would have people in it again, real people moving through its rooms, and then they would leave and it would be mine again in the deep, quiet way it had always been mine. Not because I owned it, though I did, but because it contained the irreplaceable accumulation of a life. I had one thing left to do. Not today. But soon. The letter I had placed on the table in the Maplewood Visitors' Lounge, the one I had told Daniel to take home and read later, was a single page, handwritten in the careful cursive my 3rd-grade teacher had drilled into me and which I had maintained out of stubbornness ever since. It was not a legal document. It contained no threats, no ultimatums, no accounting of grievances. It was simply the truth of what I felt, and what I had decided, written in my own voice in my own hand. Daniel had called Wednesday evening, 4 days after the Sunday meeting, to tell me he had read it. He had been quiet on the phone in a way I had not heard from him in years. Not the managed quiet of someone controlling a conversation. The genuine quiet of someone sitting with something that had changed the interior landscape. He had said, "Mom, I didn't understand what I was doing." I had said, "I know, Danny. That's in the letter too." He had said, "I don't know how to fix it." And I had said, gently, honestly, without false comfort, You start by understanding that some things don't get fixed. They get carried differently. And you decide, going forward, what kind of son you want to be. He had not responded immediately. But he had not hung up either. We had stayed on the line together for a while. Not quite talking, not quite silent. It was, I thought, a beginning. Small and uncertain and real. Summer came to Clearwater Drive the way I had always loved it best. Gradually, without announcement, the days lengthening so slowly you could almost believe the light was choosing to stay. By the second week of June I had replanted the raised beds. Tomatoes along the back row, the Roma variety Richard had always preferred because he said they were honest tomatoes. No pretension, just flavor. Basil in the center bed, which smells when the morning sun hits it, like every good summer I have ever lived compressed into a single breath. And along the front edge of the third bed, facing the yard, something new, lavender, which I had never grown before but had always meant to, and which Gloria had mentioned once in passing, in the way she mentioned things she considered important, which was without emphasis, as though the value was self-evident. I planted it on a Tuesday morning in the particular early summer light that is gold without being heavy, and I thought about her while I did it. I had called her twice since leaving Maplewood. She answered both times on the first ring and pretended not to be pleased, which was her way of being pleased. She had told me on the second call that her daughter had visited. An actual visit, not flowers. They had eaten lunch together in the common room and her daughter had stayed 3 hours. Was it good? Had asked. It was a start, Gloria had said. And I could hear, underneath her characteristically deflated delivery, something that was not quite hope but was hope's immediate neighbor. I pressed the last lavender plant into the soil and sat back on my heels and looked at the garden. The cedar beds Richard had built. His careful joinery still solid, still square, the wood weathered to a beautiful silver gray. The roses along the fence were in full bloom now. Deep pink, almost red, the color they always achieved in June when the conditions were exactly right. The yard was alive in the specific way that things are alive when they have been tended consistently and with love over a long period of time. Richard would have approved of the lavender. He was a man who appreciated additions that took a long time to show their full effect. I missed him with a steady, incorporated ache of someone who has learned that grief does not diminish so much as it becomes part of the structure. Load-bearing, present, something you build around rather than something that goes away. I had stopped waiting for it to go away sometime in the second year. Once I stopped waiting, I found I could carry it without putting everything else down. Daniel came on a Saturday in late June. He came alone. I had not asked him to come without Renee. He had made that decision himself, which told me something about where he was in his own interior reckoning. He pulled into the driveway in the Silverado and sat in it for a moment before getting out, which I observed from the kitchen window without making myself visible, because I wanted to see him when he didn't know he was being seen. He looked, sitting in that truck in my driveway, like a man who had been thinking hard about something for a long time and had not yet finished thinking. Older than 44 briefly. Then he got out and squared his shoulders and came to the door. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I had helped him with his homework, where he had told me he was getting married, where Richard and I had sat on the morning of his funeral, and I had drunk 3 cups of coffee without tasting any of them because the alternative was to feel the silence of the house too fully. We talked for 2 hours. I will not recount all of it. Some things that happen between a mother and her son belong only to that table, that kitchen, that particular Saturday light. What I will say is that Daniel said things he had not said before. Not because he had not felt them, I think, but because he had spent 44 years learning, partly from watching me, that feelings were things you managed rather than expressed. Which was a lesson I had perhaps, without intending to, taught him imperfectly. He said he had been afraid after his father died, in a way he hadn't known how to hold. That the house, and me in it, had represented something whose weight he had wanted to put down without admitting he was carrying it. He said Renee had offered him a framework, practical, forward-looking, a plan, and that he had taken it because it felt like solid ground when everything else felt like water. He was not excusing himself. I could see the effort it took to say the thing without the excuse attached. I told him about the mornings in my room at Maplewood, about the notebook, About Walter, about Claire, about Gloria. I told him about watching the maple tree turn from bare to green from a parking lot window. I told him that I had been angrier than I had let on, and lonelier, and that both of those things had eventually burned down to something cleaner and more useful. "What did the letter say?" he asked. "I mean, I read it. But I want to hear you say it." I looked at my son across the kitchen table. "It said that I love you in the way that parents love children, which is without conditions, but not without consequences. That love and accountability are not opposites. That what you did came from fear and selfishness. And I understand both of those things because I am human and I have felt them too." Pause. "And it said that I have changed my will, and that he should know that, not as a punishment, but as an honest reflection of what I value and what I've decided to do with what Richard and I built." Daniel was quiet. "What did you change?" "The house," I said. "Will go to Lily. With a condition that she may not sell it for 10 years. So that she has time to understand what it is before she decides what it's worth." Kept my voice steady. "A portion of the estate will go to Claire, who showed up when I needed someone. A portion to a literacy foundation in Columbus that I have supported for years. And there is something for you, Danny. Not nothing. I want you to know that." I looked at him directly. "But it is less than it would have been. And that is simply the truth of what happened, recorded honestly." He absorbed this. His jaw worked once, the same gesture as in the Maplewood Visitors' Lounge, that brief tightening and release. "That's fair," he said finally, quietly. "I know," I said. "That's why I did it that way." We finished our coffee. He walked through the house before he left, not with the appraising eye of a man calculating square footage, but slowly with his hands in his pockets, the way you walk through a place you are trying to remember correctly. He stood in the doorway of his childhood bedroom for a moment. He touched the frame of Richard's armchair. At the front door he turned and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was very young. Open, unguarded, slightly uncertain. The face beneath the face he had learned to wear. "Can I come back?" he asked. "Just regularly. For coffee. No agenda." I considered him for a moment. This man I had loved before the world had gotten to him. This man who had lost his way and was finding, slowly and imperfectly, the first steps back. "Yes," I said. "You can come back." He nodded. He hugged me at the door. Longer than the stiff, brief hug in my Maplewood room. Longer and less certain and more real. Then he walked to his truck and drove away. I stood on my front porch in the June afternoon and watched him go. The street was quiet and tree-lined and warm, the air full of the sounds of a neighborhood in summer. A lawnmower somewhere distant, children's voices 2 doors down, a cardinal moving through the oak tree at the edge of my yard with that particular urgent brightness that cardinals have, as though they know something about color that the rest of the world is still catching up to. I thought about the morning I had left this house. The coffee maker, its red light blinking. The smell of dark roast drifting through a kitchen I had believed, in that hollow March morning, I might not stand in again. I was standing in it again. That evening I sat on the back porch as the sun went down behind the fence. The roses were luminous in the low light, that deep June pink holding its color against the dimming sky. The lavender at the edge of the garden had not yet bloomed, but it was established now, its roots finding their depth in the soil of the raised bed, doing the slow, invisible work that precedes everything beautiful. I had my notebook on my knee. The evening settling around me with a particular generosity of long summer days that do not rush their endings. I did not write anything. I simply sat in my garden, in the house that was mine, in the life that was mine, and let the evening come. Above the back fence the sky moved through its colors, amber to rose to the soft clear blue that comes just before dark, and I watched it without needing it to mean anything beyond what it was. Which was enough. Which had always been enough. The first firefly of the evening appeared at the edge of the yard, near the roses, a single small light blinking on and off against the gathering dusk. Then another. Then, quietly, several more, rising from the grass, drifting upward through the warm air, each one carrying its small brightness through the dark without urgency, without drama, simply present, simply lit, in the patient and unhurried way of things that know exactly where they are. I watched them for a long time. I was 72 years old. I was home. And I was, in the deepest and most honest sense of the word, the sense that has nothing to do with the absence of pain and everything to do with the presence of self, perfectly, quietly, completely all right.